Hey. Welcome to the mission, Fiction Mission. Today I'm going to be talking about Q, sharing thoughts on Q. And really the question is to Q or not to Q? That is the question. So let's get into it. Q. What is Q? I assume you know the basics. Q is material in Matthew and Luke that is shared, but it's not found in Mark. So it's a hypothetical source. Um, and so Q really is a kind of a fork in the road. You could either take this fork or take that fork. One way is you think that there was a hypothetical source that existed that contained all these Jesus sayings, or you don't. So let's discuss both sides of the coin and see what we come up with. All right, first side of the coin, first direction. Let's assume that there was a hypothetical source of Jesus sayings, and this requires speculation, of course, because there is no physical source known. It's a completely speculative, hypothetical source. Okay, so the first level of speculation is that there was just some sort of document. And of course, we have no physical evidence of such a document. The second level of speculation is that this document actually predates Mark. In other words, is even earlier than Mark. And the third level of speculation is that, well, that this document sort of accurately records, because it's so early, because it's so far before Mark, that it accurately records the essence of Jesus's actual teachings or actual sayings. All right, so right there you got three levels of speculation going down this path. Now, at this point, no such document has been discovered, but let's imagine what it would take in order to confirm such a document. Number one, you'd have to find some kind of fragment that contained what is called Q, the shared elements in Matthew and Luke. So you'd have to find some sort of document that had those specific verses, and then you'd also have to have a fragment that would have those verses sort of in a collection of sayings, and there would, in other words, the whole kind of narrative of what's going on, the narrative of the story would be missing. So you just have sort of a collection of sayings. And then thirdly, you would actually have to date this text somehow earlier than the earliest versions of Mark. So you'd have to independently date it because, of course, even after Matthew or Luke was written, somebody could easily collate or bring together just the sayings in a document, and that document could actually be quite early, as long as it's after Matthew and Luke were written. But let's say that's in the 2nd century. So there would really be three things that would have to be found in such a document. Number one, certain verses. Number two, no narrative, just a collection of various sayings, as the Q hypothesis goes. And then thirdly, you'd have to be able to independently date it, say, prior to 70, or which is typically around the time Mark is dated, or actually after the temple destruction, going by sort of standard consensus scholarship. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of speculation, and if we were ever to confirm that speculation, it would be quite difficult to even confirm it, if we were to find something. So that's a summary of going down that path towards the Q hypothesis. But so if that's a little too much, if the hypothesis is too speculative for your taste, and you lose hope of being able to confirm it, just back up a little bit, uh, to be to consider the scenario of no Q. Let's say there was no Q. What state would we be in? Well, number one, we would have Mark written, and we'd have a narrative about Jesus. We'd have John the Baptist. We'd have the crucifixion, betrayal, crucifixion, and we'd also have a an empty tomb, right? So what we'd be missing in Mark, we would be missing all kinds of sayings of Jesus. Mark would have been written without containing any meaningful, or what we think of as the sayings of Jesus. There'd be no birth narrative, no sayings, no real sayings. There'd be a lot of miracles, of course, and there would be a crucifixion and there would be a resurrection, but there would be no post-resurrection appearances. So that's how the development would appear to a historical scholar. There would be a Jesus. He would have a historical Jesus, and his followers would have followed him. There would be Paul. There'd be all Paul's writings, of course, and then somehow Paul's vision of Jesus would get exaggerated with all kinds of miracles that would ultimately result in the Gospel of Mark. But that gospel would not have birth narrative or post resurrection appearances, and it would not have most of the sayings that we associate with Jesus. All right. So then the question becomes, uh, what happened between Mark and Matthew and Luke? Like, where did all these sayings come from? And at this point, you're in a situation, well, actually, the situation we're in right now, because we have no evidence of Q, and all of the Q hypothesis is speculative. So this is actually the state we're in right now. We have a Gospel of Mark without all the things I've mentioned, yet we see that all the things that it is lacking were added in future versions of the gospel story, meaning in the future synoptics, meaning Mark and Luke. All these things that were missing were added in future versions. So the question becomes, why were these things added? This is the state we're in. Why were they added? Now, in my opinion, it's quite easy to see that the things that were added were things that people would naturally be curious about if they were reading Mark, or if they had come to believe in the story of Mark, or believed that the accounts and the activities did happen in history. The things that were added in future versions were the things that anyone would naturally be curious about. For example, you'd be naturally curious where this person came from, how he was born, what happened to him after the empty tomb. Uh, you'd actually be curious about many of the things he taught. It's one thing for God in the flesh to perform miracles, but you really would be curious about the kind of things he would say. So, in my opinion, it's quite easy to imagine that the limited story of Mark would be fertile ground for embellishment. Let's put it that way. And that's kind of what we see in Mark and Luke. We do see embellishment. We see new scenes, new sayings, and it's anyone's guess where all this new content that was added to Mark came from. It's anyone's guess. Um, all right. So we've sort of examined, we've gone down the Q path, we've examined the state we're in with the non-Q path, and that's an important point. Where we're at in biblical studies right now is we're in the no Q state. That's the state we're in. So the hypothesis is that there would be a Q. That's the speculative state. And the speculative state is not confirmed by any physical evidence or any written fragments or anything. All right. So, in conclusion, what is the point of this video? The point is we are in the non-Q state. It's the state we're in, and until something's found, that's the state we're in, and the burden of proof is on Q supporters to come up with physical evidence or historical evidence of such a thing. All right. Now, a few words on why the Q hypothesis exists at all. Why is it so commonly held or believed, I guess you could say. Now, from an apologist point of view, or true believers, Christians, traditional Christians, the Q hypothesis is generally ridiculed because, for example, apologists already believe that the contents of Mark and Luke are inspired, and they're all, they already believe that the sayings of Jesus are authentic. So the idea of historically confirming what is already the tradition of the church is not a burden that apologists typically take upon themselves. So why do critical historical scholars propose a Q hypothesis? Why do they support it, and why do they push for it? Well, really the reason is it's quite simple. And it's because they really want to know what the historical Jesus said. And when you limit yourself to simply Mark, there are so many things that Jesus did not say or were not recorded or did not make it into Mark. And understanding, as critical scholars do, that Q was the first gospel written, it really makes them scratch their head why there were not more sayings recorded, and why did the author of Mark not know all the great things that Jesus said? Why was it incumbent on future gospel writers to include them? And so, really, the Q hypothesis allows historical scholars to work around this conundrum. It allows the sayings of Jesus to predate Mark and circumvent Mark as in whole. It allows a path for Jesus' sayings to come into the Gospels of Matthew and Luke around Mark, not through Mark, around Mark. And if there was such a document that it can be hypothesized to be early, much earlier than Mark, and contain the genuine words of Jesus, well, that's a goal worth pursuing for the historical Jesus scholar. So that's why there's such an emphasis on it, is because there really is a desire to know what the historical Jesus said and what he taught. And the simple fact is that the earliest gospel doesn't have very much of what he taught, but it does contain quite a bit about what he did, at least from the time of John the Baptist to the time of his crucifixion and burial. It contains actions, but it contains very little actual sayings. And of course, if you want to develop a church and you want to teach the flock or believers what God thinks or what God said or what God taught, it's a much deeper well, or much richer well, if you actually had sayings that the incarnate God on earth spoke and said. So it's easy to see why it was necessary as the church was developing um, to expand the Gospel of Mark into the Gospel of Matthew and Luke. It was important to expand it to get those sayings in there, because the obviously belief in Jesus had grown and the church had grown, but people were lacking. They were lacking the teachings of Jesus. All they had was what you might call Paul's version of Jesus, a savior figure, etc., who did something to transform their lives or transform their spirit, as Jesus was transformed. But he just didn't say enough. So there was a great motivation to add a lot of the things that he said or supposedly said, depending on your belief. All right, I hope that is a brief analysis of the whole question of to Q or not to Q. I hope I've given arguments on both sides, and you could probably see where I fall on this argument. Understanding why people are searching so hard for Q, and how important it is to historical scholars to find something, because otherwise you're left with the scenario of having Mark with really not much content, and uh, uh, it's quite a conundrum to imagine the Christian religion with only Mark. If there were no Matthew developed, no Luke developed, no John, fourth gospel much later developed, what would Christianity be if all you had was Mark uh, to develop theology, to develop an organized church, or an organized religion? If you only had Mark, things would be quite different. So, as they say, nature abhors a vacuum. There was a great vacuum in Mark, which got eventually filled with Matthew, Luke, and John. So, all right. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment. I'm looking forward to comments. If you like the video, like, fine, but type something. Let me know what you think. If you agree, disagree. I'm looking forward to your feedback, and I hope to get some. All right. Thanks a lot.